There is a version of World War II that most people carry with them. It involves clear sides and clear purposes. It involves a civilized world pushed to its limits by a force of organized evil, and it involves that world rising, suffering, and ultimately prevailing. It is a story that ends with photographs of celebration, with ticker tape and embraces in city squares, with the feeling that something righteous had been accomplished at enormous cost. That version of the war exists. Parts of it are accurate, but it is not the whole story, and the parts that have been removed, reclassified, quietly buried in filing cabinets, or simply never acknowledged are not minor footnotes. They are structural. They describe how the war actually functioned at the level of institutions, orders, paperwork, and routine. The most disturbing thing about World War II is not that atrocities occurred. Atrocities occur in all wars. The most disturbing thing is how many of them were administered, how many required signatures, how many passed through chains of command without triggering alarm because the alarm had been built out of the system before the system was set into motion. The war was not a rupture in civilization. In many of its most troubling dimensions, it was civilization operating as designed, with all its bureaucratic efficiency, its institutional hierarchy, its talent for normalizing whatever it needed to normalize in order to continue functioning. What follows is a narration of 19 incidents, programs, decisions, and institutional silences from the Second World War that the military establishments involved never fully explained. Some were investigated and then buried. Some were acknowledged in partial form, with the most consequential details withheld. Some remain in archives marked with access restrictions that have never been lifted. And some were simply absorbed into the record without comment, because the people who would have raised objections had already been conditioned by the logic of total war to understand that objection was not their function. The war lasted 6 years on its broadest timeline. It involved over 30 countries. It produced more than 70 million deaths by most calculations, though the actual number depends on which deaths you choose to count and which you choose to attribute to other causes. The paperwork it generated fills warehouses, and within that paperwork, between the supply manifests and the casualty reports and the strategic memos, are the records of things that were done, known, sanctioned, and subsequently not discussed. This narration is about some of those things. It is not a condemnation. It is not a tribute. It is an account of what happened inside a machine that was built to function efficiently and did. The first incident concerns a program that the United States Army administered throughout the European theater, and that was known, at various levels of command, by different names, depending on what aspect of it was being discussed. It is most accurately described as a systematic program of censorship applied not to enemy communications, but to the letters and personal documents of American soldiers who had witnessed, participated in, or been ordered to report on incidents that the Army considered damaging to morale or to the public image of Allied military conduct. The program was not secret in its broad outlines. Soldiers knew their mail was read. Officers knew reports were filtered before being transmitted upward. What was less understood, and what the Army never explained with specificity, was the degree to which this censorship extended to suppressing accounts of friendly fire incidents, unauthorized executions of prisoners, civilian deaths caused by Allied bombing or ground operations, and the treatment of surrendering enemy soldiers in ways that violated the Geneva Conventions. There were soldiers who wrote home describing things they had seen that troubled them. They wrote because writing was one of the few ways available to process what they had experienced. Many of those letters never arrived. Some were held indefinitely, some were destroyed. The soldiers who sent them were sometimes interviewed by officers, sometimes warned, sometimes transferred to units where their particular knowledge would be less coherent because it would be separated from the context in which they had acquired it. This was not the work of a single malicious actor. It was the work of a system that had identified, correctly from an institutional standpoint, that certain kinds of information created problems and that preventing those problems was a legitimate military objective. The system performed this function the way any bureaucratic system performs its functions, through assigned roles, through established procedures, through the distribution of responsibility across enough individuals that no single person needed to understand or authorize the whole. The soldiers whose accounts were suppressed did not, for the most part, protest loudly. Some did not know their letters had been intercepted. Some suspected but had no way to confirm. Some understood what had happened and made a calculation that silence was safer than complaint. The war was ongoing. They were still in it. The institutional logic that had suppressed their accounts was the same institutional logic that determined where they slept, what they ate, and whether they were sent to positions that were more or less likely to get them killed. Objection under those conditions requires a particular kind of courage that is different from battlefield courage, and it was not, in the main, forthcoming. The program did not end with the war. Veterans who returned and attempted to publish accounts of what they had witnessed encountered publishing establishments that had been, in many cases, informally coordinated with the same military public affairs infrastructure that had managed the censorship program during the conflict. Books were not published. Manuscripts were returned with editorial notes that focused on problems of tone or commercial viability. The information existed. It circulated in private, among veterans, in bars, in VFW halls, in the kind of conversations that leave no record. But it did not enter the official narrative, and by the time the official narrative had hardened sufficiently that challenging it became academically and journalistically possible, many of the men who had witnessed the relevant events were dead. The second incident, or more accurately the second category of incidents, concerns the treatment of German prisoners of war held in American custody, not in Germany, but on American soil, and in France and North Africa during and immediately after the active combat phase of the European War. The official record describes these prisoners as having been treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. The official record is incomplete. There were approximately 400,000 German prisoners held in camps across the United States. They worked. The arrangement was formally lawful under the relevant provisions of international law, which permitted prisoner labor in exchange for compensation. The compensation was minimal. The work was real. Prisoners harvested crops, processed food, performed construction, and provided labor to industries that were experiencing severe workforce shortages because the domestic male workforce had been substantially redirected toward the military. What the official record does not fully account for is what happened to prisoners held in temporary facilities in France in the months immediately following the German surrender in May of 1945. An American officer named Martin Pogue assembled accounts suggesting that conditions in certain Rhine Meadow camps, which held hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and civilians classified as disarmed enemy forces rather than prisoners of war, a classification that was legally significant because it removed the Geneva Convention protections applicable to prisoners of war, resulted in deaths from exposure, starvation, and dysentery on a scale that the Army chose not to document with precision. The Army's own records for these camps contain unusual gaps. Population figures do not reconcile with transfer and release records in ways that would be expected if all individuals had been accounted for. Mortality figures recorded by the Army are substantially lower than the figures that German Red Cross personnel and other observers who gained access to the camps attempted to document. The decision to classify these individuals as disarmed enemy forces rather than prisoners of war was made at the command level. It was a legal determination that had direct, foreseeable consequences for the physical conditions under which the individuals would be held. It was made after the Geneva Conventions had been in force for years, and the implications of the distinction were understood by the officers who made and implemented it. The men who died in these camps, if the higher mortality estimates are accurate, died not from the chaos of active combat, but from the deliberate application of a legal category that removed their formal protection. The Army never provided a full accounting of the population, the mortality, or the decision-making process behind the classification system used in these facilities. The historical record on this subject remains contested in ways that the available primary documentation cannot fully resolve, because the documentation that would resolve it is either incomplete or inaccessible. The third incident concerns a series of events in the Pacific Theater that involved the treatment of Japanese prisoners of war and, in certain documented cases, the taking of body parts from Japanese combat dead as trophies. The latter practice was widespread enough that military publications, including Stars and Stripes, made editorial note of it. Life magazine published a photograph in 1944 in which an American woman was shown writing a letter beside a Japanese skull sent to her by her boyfriend in the Pacific, a sailor, who had inscribed the skull with a personal dedication. The magazine received letters of appreciation. The photograph was not considered remarkable by a significant portion of its readership. The practice of taking ears, teeth, fingers, and skulls from Japanese dead, and in some cases from Japanese prisoners who were killed specifically for this purpose, was documented in after-action reports, in personal diaries that survived the war, in accounts given to military investigators, and in the records of chaplains who reported it as a pastoral concern. The Army's response to this documentation was to issue directives prohibiting the practice. The directives were reissued multiple times throughout the war, which is itself an indication of the degree to which they were being observed. The directives did not result in prosecutions. Personnel were not court-martialed for the documented collection of human remains from enemy dead. The practice continued, and the Army, having issued its directives, considered its institutional obligation fulfilled. What is less discussed is the parallel practice of refusing to take Japanese prisoners under circumstances where the taking of prisoners was operationally feasible. Accounts from infantry units operating on Pacific Islands describe a normative environment in which surrendering Japanese soldiers were killed as a matter of routine rather than exception, not always out of tactical necessity, sometimes because of a contempt for surrender that had been cultivated both by the behavior of Japanese forces, who sometimes used the appearance of surrender as a tactical maneuver, and by a broader dehumanization that had been built systematically into training, into the visual culture of the war, and into the institutional framing of the Pacific conflict as something categorically different from the European theater. Intelligence officers complained repeatedly that the refusal to take prisoners was limiting their ability to gather tactical information. Their complaints were heard. They did not substantially change the practice. The Army investigated specific incidents when they came to command attention with enough specificity to require a response. The investigations generally produced findings that attributed individual deaths to the heat of combat or to the unwillingness of Japanese personnel to surrender under conditions where surrender was being offered. They did not produce systematic examinations of the command environment that had normalized the refusal to take prisoners or the institutional culture that had made the collection of human remains a practice widespread enough to require repeated official prohibition. The fourth incident concerns the firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th into the morning of March 10th, 1945, and the deliberate strategic and bureaucratic decisions that shaped how it was conducted, recorded, and subsequently characterized. Operation Meeting House, as it was designated, involved approximately 334 B-29 bombers dropping incendiary bombs on the densely populated residential districts of the Japanese capital. The fires that resulted killed somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 people in a single night. This figure exceeds the immediate death toll from either of the atomic bomb attacks that would follow later that year. The decision to shift American bombing strategy from precision attacks on industrial targets to area incendiary attacks on civilian residential districts was made by General Curtis LeMay without explicit prior authorization for that specific escalation. LeMay made the decision. He ordered it executed. He did so with the understanding that it would produce mass civilian casualties because that was the operational theory behind area incendiary bombing of wooden residential structures. The theory was not incidental to the strategy. Civilian casualties were not collateral to the objective. In the operational planning documents, the relationship between the bombing pattern, the construction materials of the target area, the anticipated wind conditions, and the resulting firestorm was calculated with the kind of precision that requires the destruction you are planning to be the destruction you intend. After the attack, LeMay cabled Washington with a description of results that emphasized the extent of structural damage in the target area. The framing was industrial. The buildings destroyed were characterized as part of the Japanese war production network, which they were, in the sense that cottage industries and small workshops contributed to war material production. They were also homes. The people who died in them were not, for the most part, industrial workers in any sense that would have been recognizable under the targeting doctrines that had officially governed American strategic bombing up to that point. The Army Air Force's own damage assessment teams documented the civilian character of the areas destroyed. Those documents entered the archive. The public characterization of the bombing campaign continued to emphasize industrial targets, dispersed production, and the operational necessity of the strategic approach. The contradiction between the internal assessment and the public characterization was not resolved. It was filed. The Army never explained, in any formal public accounting, the process by which the decision was made to conduct area bombing of civilian residential districts, who authorized it, what legal framework governed it, and how it related to the Hague and Geneva Conventions and to the United States' own stated bombing doctrine. LeMay himself, years later, in a context removed from the immediate institutional pressures of wartime, acknowledged that if the United States had lost the war, he would likely have been prosecuted as a war criminal. The acknowledgement was made in passing, in an interview that did not receive extensive attention. It remains one of the most precise official adjacent descriptions of the gap between what was done and what was permissible under the laws of war that any senior military figure from that conflict ever offered. The fifth incident concerns a program known as Operation Paperclip, which was not publicly acknowledged until decades after the war, and which involved the systematic recruitment, extraction, and subsequent employment of German scientists, engineers, and technical personnel by the United States military and intelligence services, including individuals who had been directly involved in the administration of concentration camp labor, the development of chemical and biological weapons, and human experimentation programs conducted on concentration camp prisoners. The program was formally illegal under the policies of the United States government as they existed at the time. Directives from the Joint Chiefs of Staff explicitly prohibited the immigration of individuals with Nazi Party membership or records of Nazi activity. The people running Operation Paperclip were aware of this prohibition. They responded to it by altering the records of the individuals they wanted to recruit. Security dossiers were rewritten. Nazi Party memberships were excised. Records of involvement in criminal programs were omitted. The altered records were then submitted to the State Department and the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which processed the applications on the basis of the information provided to them. The alterations were made by American military intelligence officers acting under the authority of military commanders who had determined that the scientific and technical value of the individuals in question outweighed other considerations. Werner von Braun, who would later lead the American space program, had been a member of the SS and had overseen the use of concentration camp labor at the Mittelwerk facility, where V-2 rockets were produced under conditions that killed thousands of workers. His Nazi Party membership and his SS rank were removed from his submitted dossier. He entered the United States on a visa obtained under a process that had been deliberately manipulated to conceal this information from the agencies responsible for making the determination. He became a citizen. He became a national hero. The process by which he was brought to the United States was classified. The classification was not lifted until long after his death. He was not an exception. The program involved more than 1,600 individuals by some estimates, spanning aerospace engineering, chemical weapons research, biological warfare programs, and medical experimentation. Some of the individuals recruited had direct operational involvement in programs that were simultaneously being prosecuted as war crimes at Nuremberg. The legal framework being applied at Nuremberg, which the United States had helped construct and was actively prosecuting, described the activities of some of the individuals being brought to America under cleared security dossiers as crimes against humanity. The Army never provided a public accounting of the criteria used to determine which individuals' past activities were disqualifying and which were not. The criteria that were applied in practice are visible in the outcomes. Individuals whose expertise was considered valuable were cleared. Individuals whose expertise was less uniquely valuable were not. The sixth incident concerns the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not in its broad outlines, which are extensively documented, but in one specific and largely unacknowledged aspect: the deliberate withholding and suppression of medical and scientific information about radiation sickness in the weeks and months following the attacks. American military personnel were aware, within days of the Hiroshima bombing, that survivors were dying of a new and unfamiliar syndrome that involved hair loss, bleeding from mucous membranes, suppression of the immune system, and rapid death in the absence of visible traumatic injury. This was radiation sickness. It was not a surprise to the scientists who had developed the bomb. The effects of high-dose radiation exposure on human beings had been studied, modeled, and were understood at the theoretical level before the bombs were dropped. When Japanese physicians and journalists began reporting on this syndrome in the weeks after the bombings, the American occupation authority suppressed the reports. A directive issued in September of 1945 classified all information relating to the effects of atomic bombs on human health. Japanese physicians were prohibited from publishing clinical observations. Film footage documenting the physical condition of survivors was confiscated and classified. An Australian journalist named Wilfred Burchett managed to reach Hiroshima and file a report describing what he observed, which was published in the London Daily Express in early September. American military officials responded by publicly denying his account, describing the reported deaths from radiation sickness as Japanese propaganda, and suggesting that Burchett had been manipulated or deceived. The suppression served an immediate institutional purpose. The narrative being constructed around the atomic bombings emphasized decisive military force applied to end the war and spare the casualties of a land invasion of Japan. Radiation sickness that continued to kill civilians weeks and months after the bombs fell. From exposure to something invisible, something that left no visible wound and caused death through what appeared to observers to be a kind of biological dissolution, did not fit within that narrative. It introduced moral and legal questions that the Army preferred to defer. The deferral lasted years. By the time American medical personnel were permitted to publish their own observations, and by the time the full extent of the radiation effects was formally acknowledged in public documentation, the institutional moment in which those facts would have been most consequential to public understanding of the decision to use atomic weapons had passed. The classified film footage documenting the physical condition of atomic bomb survivors was not released publicly for decades. When it was released incrementally, with some portions remaining restricted for additional years. The total suppression period for some of this material exceeded 50 years. The seventh incident concerns a documented series of mass executions of Italian and other civilian prisoners carried out by German forces in Italy during 1944, and the subsequent decision by Allied command, specifically American and British command, not to pursue prosecution of the responsible officers and soldiers in the immediate post-war period, and in some cases to actively impede the Italian judicial process that sought to pursue such prosecutions. The Marzabotto massacre, conducted by the 14th Waffen-SS Panzer Grenadier Division in the Apennine Mountains in September and October of 1944, resulted in the killing of approximately 770 civilians, including women, children, and elderly individuals. It was one of the largest massacres of civilians committed in Western Europe during the war. The responsible officer, SS Major Walter Redder, was identified, tried by an Italian military tribunal in 1951, and sentenced to life imprisonment. The proceedings leading to his capture and trial were not facilitated by American military authorities. They were conducted despite the approach of American authorities, who had, in the years immediately following the war, possessed custody of Redder and related documentation and had not initiated prosecution. The broader pattern involved what Italian investigators and historians later documented as a deliberate decision by American and British intelligence services to protect former German officers who had committed atrocities in Italy on the grounds that these individuals possessed intelligence value regarding Soviet capabilities and intentions, or could be useful in the early infrastructure of what would become the Cold War intelligence apparatus in Europe. This was not a spontaneous or undocumented process. Files relating to it were discovered in a cabinet in the Italian military archive in Rome in 1994. The files had been turned face to the wall in the cabinet, which is why they had not been reviewed in the decades since they were deposited there. The files documented a systematic decision taken at the institutional level not to pursue prosecution of individuals whose crimes had been documented and whose identities were known. The Army never explained this decision in any formal public accounting. The eighth incident concerns the behavior of American forces at Dachau concentration camp on the day of its liberation, April 29, 1945. The liberation of Dachau is documented in photographs that show American soldiers opening the gates and the emaciated survivors of the camp encountering their liberators. It is one of the iconic images of the Allied moral purpose in the European war. What is less documented in the official record is what happened in the hours immediately following the initial liberation. There were approximately 500 SAS guards and camp personnel present in or around the camp when American forces arrived. A portion of them, estimates vary in the historical literature but generally fall between 17 and more than 100, were killed by American soldiers after they had surrendered or been taken prisoner. Some were shot in a courtyard near the camp entrance. Some were killed individually in various locations around the facility. Soldiers who were present described the killings in diaries and letters. An Army investigation was initiated. The investigation produced a report. The report was classified. The officer who initiated the killings or failed to prevent them, Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, was cleared by his commanding general, Brigadier General Henning Linden, who was himself present during some of the events. The investigation was closed without charges being filed. The killings at Dachau were not a secret among the personnel who were there. They were discussed among veterans and found their way into oral histories, memoirs, and eventually into academic historical work. The Army's official position for decades was that the events either did not occur in the manner described or could not be specifically attributed to identified personnel acting unlawfully given the conditions of the liberation. The investigation report remained classified until it was obtained through archival research in the 1980s. Its contents had been accurately described, in general terms, by veterans who were present for decades before the document was declassified. The ninth incident concerns the American-administered Nuremberg Tribunal itself, specifically the decision regarding which defendants to prosecute, which evidence to present, and which categories of conduct to pursue as criminal, and how those decisions were shaped by the simultaneous interest of American military and legal authorities in establishing precedents and frameworks that would not retroactively implicate Allied conduct during the same conflict. The tribunal prosecuted German leaders for, among other things, the strategic bombing of civilian populations, the bombing of Rotterdam, the bombing of Coventry, the bombing of Belgrade were cited as evidence of German criminal intent. By the time the tribunal concluded its proceedings, the United States and Britain had conducted strategic bombing campaigns against civilian and urban targets that had killed substantially more civilians than the German attacks cited as criminal in the indictments. Dresden had been bombed, Hamburg had been bombed, Tokyo had been bombed, Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been bombed. The individuals who had ordered these attacks were not defendants at Nuremberg. They were, in several cases, serving as technical advisors to the prosecution. When German Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring and other defendants raised this point during the proceedings, specifically invoking the Allied bombing campaigns as evidence that the conduct being prosecuted was practiced by both sides, the tribunal addressed this through a doctrine that became known informally as the tu quoque defense rejection, which held that the criminal nature of an act was not absolved by evidence that the opposing side had committed the same act. This was a legally coherent position within the framework of the tribunal. It was also a position that required the tribunal to maintain a strict asymmetry. Allied conduct was simply not before the court, and no mechanism existed within the tribunal structure for it to become so. The individuals who designed that structure were the same individuals whose conduct was excluded by it. The tribunal produced convictions. It produced executions. It produced a framework for international criminal law that has had lasting consequences. It also produced a historical record of the Second World War's atrocities that was organized around a distinction between criminal and non-criminal conduct that was drawn, in part, by the parties who had an interest in where the line was placed. The 10th incident concerns the American and British decision to continue conventional bombing operations on German cities in the final weeks of the war. After the military outcome of the conflict had been effectively determined, and after the transportation and industrial infrastructure targets that had theoretically justified strategic bombing had been substantially destroyed or made irrelevant by the collapse of German logistics. Dresden was bombed on February 13th and 14th, 1945. The German defeat occurred approximately 2.5 months later. The bombing killed somewhere between 22,000 and 25,000 people, with higher estimates in earlier post-war literature having been subsequently revised downward by German historical research, though the figures remain a subject of some disagreement. The city was known to contain an extremely large number of refugees who had fled the advancing Soviet forces on the Eastern Front. The refugee presence was documented in intelligence assessments available to Allied planners before the attack. The attack was ordered. It was executed. The operational justification offered at the time described Dresden as a significant transportation hub and industrial center supporting German military operations. The targeting documents available to historians describe a city that was, at the time of the attack, considerably less significant to ongoing German military operations than its designation as a target suggested, and considerably more significant as a concentration of civilian refugee population. The decision to bomb it, at the moment it was bombed, with the force it was bombed with, was made within an institutional framework that had normalized area bombing of German urban centers to the degree that the calculation of civilian cost against military benefit had effectively ceased to operate as a meaningful constraint. After the war, Air Marshal Arthur Harris, who had commanded Bomber Command and who had been the primary architect of the British area bombing campaign, was not awarded a peerage, which was unusual for a commander of his seniority who had led operations of such scale throughout the war. His veterans did not receive a campaign medal for Bomber Command service until 2013, 68 years after the end of the war. These institutional choices communicated something about how the governments involved had evaluated the campaign, but they did not constitute an explanation. And no formal explanation of the area bombing campaign's consistency with the laws of war or with stated Allied bombing doctrine was ever provided. The 11th incident concerns a less-known program in the Pacific Theater by which American submarines were ordered, beginning in 1942, to conduct unrestricted warfare against Japanese civilian shipping, including vessels carrying civilian passengers and crews not directly involved in military supply chains. The order was issued on the day after Pearl Harbor. It directed American submarines to conduct unrestricted warfare, which meant sinking Japanese ships without warning and without provision for the safety of crews or passengers, in direct violation of the same international protocols that the United States had cited when condemning German submarine warfare in both the First and Second World Wars. German unrestricted submarine warfare had been cited as a cause for American entry into the First World War. In the early years of the Second World War, prior to American entry, American officials and press had characterized German submarine attacks on civilian shipping as evidence of German barbarism and disregard for international law. The unrestricted warfare order issued to American submarines in December of 1941 applied precisely the same operational doctrine that had been characterized as criminal when applied by Germany. American submarines sank Japanese ships throughout the Pacific for the duration of the war. They sank ships carrying military supplies. They also sank ships carrying civilian passengers, hospital ships, prison ships carrying Allied prisoners of war, and vessels whose civilian or protected character was either known or knowable from available intelligence. The sinking of ships carrying Allied prisoners of war was not rare. It occurred repeatedly. American submarines, operating under orders that did not require them to determine the character of target vessels before firing, sank vessels carrying thousands of Allied prisoners being transported within the Japanese Empire. The prisoners drowned, burned, or were machine-gunned in the water. The American submarine commanders were following orders that were within the framework of their operational directive. The deaths of Allied prisoners were documented in after-action reports. The program of unrestricted submarine warfare that created the conditions for those deaths was not reviewed, not prosecuted, and not formally reconciled with the international legal framework that American diplomacy had invoked when German forces did the same thing. The 12th incident concerns the Japanese-American internment program and the specific role of the United States Army in its design, implementation, and administration. This program is more broadly known than most of the others discussed here, but its military dimensions are frequently characterized in ways that obscure the degree to which the Army was not merely implementing a civilian political decision, but was itself the primary institutional advocate for the program and the primary designer of its architecture. General John DeWitt, commanding the Western Defense Command, produced the military necessity justification for the internment order. His arguments were explicitly racial in character. His report stated that the loyalty of Japanese Americans could not be determined by any investigative means, and that Japanese racial characteristics made the entire population a security risk regardless of citizenship or demonstrated behavior. These statements were included in the official military justification transmitted to the Department of Justice and to the Supreme Court, which upheld the program in 1944. The statements were false. Not theoretically problematic or legally contested, but false. The Army possessed intelligence assessments that directly contradicted the claims made in DeWitt's report. The Office of Naval Intelligence had concluded that Japanese Americans did not represent a significant security threat. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had reached similar conclusions. These assessments were not included in the materials transmitted to the Supreme Court. The brief presented to the Supreme Court included representations about military necessity that the Army's own intelligence apparatus had contradicted, and those contradictions were withheld from the justices who were ruling on the program's legality. This was established through the legal process of coram nobis in the 1980s, when lawyers representing individuals convicted of violating the internment orders presented the suppressed intelligence documents to federal courts and demonstrated that the original convictions had been obtained through government misconduct. The convictions were vacated. The Army's conduct in withholding the contradicting intelligence was never subject to a formal accountability process. No officer was disciplined for transmitting false or misleading information to the Supreme Court of the United States in furtherance of a racial internment program. The 13th incident concerns the American Army's conduct during the liberation of the Philippines in 1944 and 45, specifically regarding the civilian casualties produced by urban combat operations in Manila, and the institutional decision about how those casualties would be characterized in official reporting. The battle for Manila in February of 1945 involved Japanese forces who conducted massacres of Filipino civilians as American forces advanced through the city. The Japanese atrocities were documented extensively and are not in dispute. The American conduct during the same battle is less examined. Artillery and air bombardment of urban areas in which Filipino civilians were sheltering produced civilian casualties that military commanders were aware of and continued to authorize. Estimates of total civilian deaths in Manila during the battle range from 100,000 upward. American after-action reports on the Manila campaign focused on the Japanese atrocities and on the operational challenges of urban combat. They documented civilian casualties in ways that attributed them primarily or exclusively to Japanese action. The contribution of American fires to the civilian death toll was not the subject of a formal military assessment that was made available in the immediate post-war period. The operational commanders who authorized the bombardment of urban areas containing civilian populations were not investigated for those decisions. The official characterization of the Manila campaign, as it entered the historical record, emphasized the rescue of civilian and military prisoners and the defeat of Japanese forces, with civilian casualties attributed to Japanese responsibility. The 14th incident concerns a specific program of the American Office of Strategic Services and later military intelligence that involved the recruitment, training, and deployment of Filipino guerrilla units under American command, some of which committed atrocities against Filipino civilians suspected of collaboration with Japanese occupation authorities. The post-war period in the Philippines involved an insurgency known as the Hook Rebellion, in which veterans of Japanese-era collaboration were killed by individuals operating within the framework of a counterinsurgency campaign that had American advisory and material support. The boundary between wartime anti-collaboration enforcement and post-war political violence was not clean. American intelligence officers were present in environments where these actions were occurring, were aware of what was occurring, and continued operational relationships with the Filipino units involved without those units being required to account for their conduct toward civilians. The American military's formal position on this period, as expressed in official histories and declassified operational records, does not engage with the question of what American personnel knew about or sanctioned in terms of violence against civilians by Filipino allied forces. The records that would most directly address this question remain restricted in ways that have made comprehensive historical assessment impossible. The 15th incident concerns the Army Signal Corps' photographic and film documentation of the liberation of Nazi concentration camps, the decisions that were made about what to film, how to present the footage, and what to do with the footage that was deemed, by the military and intelligence authorities reviewing it, to be too graphically disturbing for public release or too specifically documented in ways that created legal or political complications. A substantial portion of the footage taken at liberated camps was not released publicly in the immediate post-war period. Some of it was released in edited form. Some of it was used in the Nuremberg proceedings. Some of it remained classified for decades. General Dwight Eisenhower ordered extensive documentation of the camps when Allied forces reached them. His stated purpose was to create an evidentiary record so thorough that the historical reality of what had occurred could not later be denied. That documentation was created. It was not fully released. The footage that was deemed too graphically disturbing for public screening was withheld. This created a paradox in which the documentary evidence was simultaneously comprehensive and selectively presented, where the purpose of preventing denial was served through documentation that was itself subjected to the kind of management that creates the conditions for selective interpretation. The decisions about what to show the public and what to withhold were made by individuals within the military information apparatus who were applying the same criteria they applied to other sensitive military information: impact on public morale, legal implications, political utility. These were legitimate institutional considerations from the perspective of the people making the decisions. They were also decisions that shaped what the public understood about what had occurred, and that shaped it in ways that served particular narratives while suppressing others. The 16th incident concerns the treatment of Black American soldiers throughout the European and Pacific campaigns, specifically the ways in which the Army's own institutional documentation recorded and then managed evidence of racial violence within American military units and between American military personnel and black soldiers. The Army was segregated throughout the war. Black soldiers served in separate units, were commanded predominantly by white officers, received inferior equipment and support in many documented instances, and were subjected to a legal and disciplinary environment in which infractions committed by black soldiers were prosecuted at higher rates and with more severe outcomes than equivalent infractions by white soldiers. This disparity was documented in the Army's own records. The Army's legal division produced analyses during the war that identified significant racial disparities in court-martial rates and sentencing. These analyses were used internally to make limited adjustments to specific procedures. They were not made public. They were not used as the basis for formal investigations of the command environment that had produced the disparities. The disparities they documented persisted throughout the war. There were incidents of lethal racial violence between white and black American soldiers in rear areas, in training camps, in transit facilities in Britain and Australia. Some of these incidents were investigated. The investigations generally produced outcomes in which black soldiers who had responded to or initiated confrontations with white soldiers were prosecuted, and white soldiers who had initiated or escalated those confrontations were not, or were prosecuted less severely. This pattern was consistent enough that it appears in the aggregate data from military justice records of the period. The Army's public presentation of its conduct toward black soldiers emphasized the contributions of units like the Tuskegee Airmen and the Buffalo Soldiers, units whose performance was cited as evidence of successful integration of black personnel into combat roles. The institutional environment that had created and maintained the conditions under which black soldiers served was not examined in any official public accounting produced by the Army during or immediately after the war. The 17th incident concerns a specific decision made at the highest levels of Allied command regarding the liberation of concentration camps on the Eastern Front and the coordination, or rather, the deliberate non-coordination between advancing American forces and advancing Soviet forces regarding the disposition of concentration camp survivors they encountered. As Soviet forces advanced into German-held territory from the east and American and British forces advanced from the west, they were liberating concentration camp populations that included not only Jewish survivors, but also Soviet citizens, Soviet soldiers who had been held as prisoners of war under conditions that had killed the majority of their original number, and other Eastern European populations. The decision about what information to share between Allied commands regarding camp locations, survivor populations, and logistical requirements was affected by the deteriorating political relationship between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union that was already visible in the final year of the war. There were specific instances in which information about camps or prisoner populations was not shared with Soviet liaison personnel, and specific instances in which Soviet forces liberated camps that had been reached or were reachable by American forces that had been redirected or held in place for reasons that were described in operational terms, but that had political dimensions that were acknowledged within the relevant command structures. The management of concentration camp liberation as a matter of military politics rather than solely humanitarian emergency was visible in the records of the final months of the war and continued into the immediate post-war period when decisions were made about displaced persons camps, repatriation, and the processing of survivor populations. The Army never provided an account of how humanitarian and political considerations were balanced in these decisions, or who made the determinations that shaped the outcomes for specific survivor populations. The 18th incident concerns the Army's specific and documentable role in managing the public narrative around the use of chemical weapons by both sides during the conflict, and the incomplete, and in some cases, deliberately misleading accounting that was provided to the public about American chemical weapons stocks, their deployment, and the incidents in which they were released either in combat, in storage accidents, or in what might most accurately be described as field testing. American forces maintained extensive chemical weapons stockpiles throughout the war. The official position was that the United States would not use chemical weapons in an offensive capacity, but retained them as a deterrent. The official position was consistent with what was publicly stated. It was not fully consistent with what the records show occurred. There were documented instances in which mustard agent and other chemical weapons were present in forward areas in ways that were inconsistent with purely defensive deterrence posture. The sinking of the cargo ship John Harvey in the port of Bari, Italy, in December of 1943 by German air attack resulted in the release of mustard agent from American stockpiles being transported on the vessel, a fact that was classified and that the American military denied for years, while Italian and Allied casualties from mustard agent exposure in the harbor were being treated under diagnoses that military medical personnel were instructed not to associate with chemical weapons. Approximately 83 American personnel and an unknown number of Italian civilians died from mustard agent exposure in the Bari incident. The presence of chemical weapons on a cargo vessel in a combat port, the deaths that resulted from their release, and the cover-up of the cause of those deaths remained classified for years. The official accounting of the Bari raid described it as a conventional air attack with conventional casualties. Medical personnel treating mustard agent casualties in Bari were instructed to attribute the symptoms to other causes. The classification was maintained in part because the presence of chemical weapons in the theater contradicted the stated American policy of chemical weapons deterrence, and in part because the civilian casualties from the agent release created legal and humanitarian complications that the Army preferred not to address publicly. The 19th incident, which is perhaps the most structurally significant of those discussed, concerns not a specific event, but a specific institutional process. The systematic declassification review conducted by the American military and intelligence establishment in the decades following the war, and the manner in which that process was used not simply to protect genuinely sensitive national security information, but to shape the historical record of the war in ways that served institutional interests. Documents relating to the incidents described in this narration did not all remain classified because they contained information that posed a continuing national security threat. Many of them were classified or remained classified because they documented conduct that contradicted the official narrative of the war as an unambiguous moral enterprise conducted by forces that, whatever their tactical excesses, operated within a framework of legitimate authority and humane purpose. The classification of these documents served the narrative. The narrative served the institutional legitimacy of the military establishment that had emerged from the war with enormous prestige and resources. The maintenance of that prestige and those resources depended, in part, on the continued public acceptance of the narrative that the documents contradicted. The declassification process was not neutral. It was administered by the same institutions whose conduct was documented in the materials being reviewed. The individuals making declassification decisions had institutional interests in the outcomes of those decisions. The result was a record that is substantially more complete than it was at the war's end, but that remains incomplete in ways that are not random or accidental. What has been released is not simply what is no longer sensitive. It is what could be released without unacceptable damage to institutional narratives that continued to serve operational purposes in the Cold War, in Korea, in Vietnam, and in the subsequent conflicts in which the institutional culture, the legal frameworks, and the patterns of behavior established during the Second World War were directly applied. The war ended in August of 1945 with the Japanese surrender. The surrender was followed by occupation, by reconstruction, by the reintegration of combatants into civilian societies, by the prosecution of a selected portion of the individuals who had committed documented atrocities, and by the construction of a historical framework that assigned the war's moral weight according to an accounting that was accurate in its broad outline and incomplete in its specific application. The systems that had allowed the war to function as it functioned, the institutional machinery for suppressing inconvenient information, the legal architecture for reclassifying human beings into categories that removed their protections, The bureaucratic normalization of mass civilian death as an acceptable operational output, the organizational culture that moved accountability upward until it became invisible and moved orders downward until their consequences were distributed across enough individuals that no single person needed to fully comprehend what they were participating in. Those systems did not end with the surrender. They were reorganized. They were transferred to new institutional contexts. They were applied to new objectives with the same procedural competence and the same institutional silence that had characterized their application during the war itself. The files were closed, the stamps were applied, the cabinets were shut.